Hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, Liv, here with the final episode in our series on the Bronze Age and its collapse. We've brought you through the Bronze Age civilizations of Greece, into a little bit, as much as we could, about the wider Mediterranean during this period, then its collapse, and all the many things that contributed to it. And so today I have for you a conversation with Dr. Eric Cline, who is honestly probably the biggest name in Bronze Age / the end of the Bronze Age and its collapse. Like, you Google Bronze Age collapse, you're probably going to get his book. It's called 1177 BC. And then there's a new one that's just come out very recently that is a sequel after 1177. So that comes up a lot in this conversation where we talk about what little things contributed to the collapse, what we do, what we don't know, what is still being learned, what has changed in the many, many years that we have been studying this stuff as humans and finding new things and using new technologies, like all the ways this stuff changes all the time just because we change and therefore we have better ways of interpreting the past. It's utterly fascinating. Eric and I had a really, really fun conversation. Such a joy. And just, I cannot wait for you to listen. So I'm just going to stop rambling and let you get right into this incredible conversation. Conversations When the Network Went Down. The Bronze Age Collapse with Dr. Eric Cline. But thank you so much for doing this. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Well, it's fun for me, and thank you for having me on. It's looking forward to it.
Good. I'm so glad. I have an assistant producer who's been working on a lot of the research because she's currently, my background is in mythology and my degree is quite old, but she's currently studying and obsessed with the Bronze Age. And so she is very excited that I'm talking to you, and she gave me some questions to ask and stuff. So there's a Michaela's somewhere being very excited that this is happening right now.
Sounds good. And Michaela's at UBC at the moment, right?
Yes, so, exactly. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, hopefully I'll be able to meet everybody in person at some point, but
yeah,
over the internets will do for now.
It's nice. At least we have this, right? I feel like it's opened up a lot in the last few years. So
it has. I was, just saying to my son that when previous books have come out, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was all radio interviews. And now it's all podcasts. The technology has totally changed.
Yeah. Well, and podcasts are great. It's so easy to record remotely. And I started it in the pandemic where I was having these conversations with experts. It's just easy and fun. And my show started out as a very casual, just like silly mythology podcast and grew to being an incredibly deeply researched and accurate mythology podcast where I touch on history. But yeah, no, it's great.
That's good. And we need more of those, the ones that are fun, interesting, and historically accurate. So there you go. You touch all the buttons.
That is my goal always. I do have to share too. I was in, it would have been just last year. Last year I was on a boat ride from Naxos to Delos. And there was this American couple sitting across from my friend and I, and they struck up a conversation and were chatting about, where we were going and everything. And the man holds up a book and he was like, "Oh, I'm so excited. I've been reading all about, the ancient world and we're going to Delos and it was your book." I was like, "Oh yeah, no, I know that book very well." Like, I was like, "I'm hoping to have him on my show eventually." So yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
It is fun. You never know the ripple effects. You never know who's reading it. As they say, you put it out into the wild and then you don't know where it goes. So that's cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I recently had an experience like that myself where I wrote a book, but it was a book of mythology out and it was commissioned by the publisher, which tends to mean that they do a lot of things without bothering to tell me. And I just find out later. And I recently had someone send me a picture of it in Turkish. And so that's how I learned that it exists in Turkish, and I would love to see it myself, but at least I have a photo for now.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah. If you have it in your contract that they have to talk to you about it when it's translated, then you find out. If it's not on the contract, then you have no idea.
Oh, it is in the contract. I actually used to work for Penguin Random House in contracts, so I know what's in my contract. They just don't do it. But that's okay. I emailed them, and eventually I'll follow up.
But did they send you a copy of it?
They are technically supposed to, so that's what my email was because I found out that it existed a couple months ago, and I emailed, and my editor was like, oh yeah, it does. And I was like, okay, great. Can I get a copy? And she was like, yeah, we'll send you one. And now I see that it's in bookshops. So I sent another being like, okay, where is it now?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll get us right in, so we, use up all of our time on this. I'm so excited. The Bronze Age, like I said, has very much been Michaela's pet project, but I've been working through all of her research and fortunately have a good grounding now before we speak. But yeah, essentially, I'd love to know more details about sort of all the different. I mean, obviously, so many things went into the collapse of the Bronze Age, and I'm fascinated in sort of the outside forces. Maybe we can focus on or the theories rather. But maybe we'll start it off with just something very simple, which is, do you have a favorite thing to talk about when it comes to this aspect, the end of the Bronze Age? Do you have like a pet bit that's your favorite?
What is my favorite part of the collapse?
Yeah.
Good question. I actually think my favorite part about the collapse, if one is allowed to put it that way, is the fact that out of all the things that have been suggested, and somebody says, choose one, which one do you like? Was it earthquake? Was it disease? Was it migration? Was it drought? And my answer is yes. Yes, it's all of the above. And as my kids would say, it was a series of unfortunate events, to quote Lemony Snicket, right? So I think that's my favorite part, is it's all of the above, right? So it's not one. You don't have to choose. You can take them all.
Well, and I think that's what makes it so much more interesting too. Like, and so much more believable, because I mean, I have this video I saw years ago that just keeps coming up in this series because it's all I can think of. And it was one of those guys on Instagram, who talks about history in that really loud and fast way where they can kind of make it sound like they know what they're talking about, even if they're spouting utter nonsense. And this guy had this whole thing about, the greatness of the Mycenaeans and how incredible they were. And then how one day they just disappeared and all died out. And the people of the Greek mainland lost the ability to understand written word. And then from the Dark Ages, Homer came up, fully formed, like Athena out of Zeus's head, and gave us this language and these stories. And it's just like the confidence with which these people say this. And then, of course, so many people believe them. And so it's the thing I keep returning to when it comes to this topic of, how no, lots of things happened. We know generally why the Mycenaean period ended, why the Bronze Age ended. And to say that humanity lost the ability to understand written word is perhaps a little cruel to humanity.
Just a little exaggerated, but
yeah.
I'm seeing things on YouTube now where you've got all these people pontificating on the late Bronze Age collapse and everything else like that. And they're going on and on and on, and not giving any credit to the actual people who have worked on this, so that their listeners think that they came up with all of it. I'm just like, whoa. First of all, give credit where credit's due. And secondly, it's like, I mean, in this case, stop mansplaining to me. That's what they're doing. So anyway, but at least the late Bronze Age is getting out there into the broader world.
Well, and it's things like this that make me want to do the series of episodes that I get to do, when I see this kind of nonsense and the lack of sources and, all of those different things. A couple of years ago, I did a similar series on Atlantis because people were going off about all the different theories on Atlantis. And, so I released a series of episodes basically breaking down all the reasons why Atlantis is literally nothing.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, I could honestly see somebody starting a podcast that would be called "Yes, But," or or "No, Not Actually." Going from there.
Yeah,
But
you
yeah,
sound confident, but
exactly. But you're right. Atlantis lends itself perfectly to it. Yeah, and I talk about that in my archaeology course, and there I'm leaning towards, well, is it Santorini if it's anything, or is it really just Plato making it up about his ideal state?
well, and yeah, I kind of landed on, it is Plato making everything up, but maybe he was inspired by the general shape and history of Santorini.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I tend to think, and I don't know how this would go in with your podcast, but I tell my students I think there is a kernel of truth at the basis of most of the myths and legends. So you can point, to the Trojan War. Yes, there is some stuff, something happened. You can point to the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur and look at the ruins of Knossos. Yes, maybe. So I think same thing. So Atlantis, maybe evocative memories of Santorini, but who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think those are important because it does give you some kind of basis for how these stories come about. And then you can look at, but where the accuracies lie and where it's mostly just, invention.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the idea of some things being, I think the word is teleological, where you're making something up to explain something you can see. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, in my Bronze Age series, I'm talking a lot about, where the oral tradition and the mythology, ties in, because obviously that's what I'm most interested in, and I think it's what's going to connect well with my listeners. I love the kenosos of it all. You look there and you're like, well, I could see how this can look like a labyrinth. Like, there's a lot of bulls too. They had a real thing for bull iconography. Like, you can see kind of where these things come about when there is 500 years gap in between.
Right, and absolutely. And when you get like wall paintings in Egypt that show people leaping over bulls in front of a labyrinth, and then you go, whoa, okay. But that dates to 1700 BCE. You're like, wait a minute. Okay, are the Minoans in contact with Egypt at that? Yes, they are. Okay, and you go from there. And same thing with the Trojan War, which I think is part and parcel of the whole late Bronze Age collapse. I've got no problem at all with something having happened at Troy. And you can point to the Hittite records where they mention not one, not two, not three, but 4 wars that they fought in and around Troy. So the question for me is not, was there a Trojan War? The question for me is, which Trojan War was Homer talking about, and how does it link to the ones that the Hittites are talking about? So I do think that there's a lot of interplay between history, archaeology, mythology, and that's where all of this comes in and is so much fun.
Yeah. Well, and it is, I mean, that's what I love so much about it. And what I've been trying to like dig into all of my scripts for this series is just where I can link in the mythological references, the ways that what the people later were looking at and how they were able to tie it to whatever cultural memory they had, and then, transform it into the myths that we have today.
And then you look at things like systems collapse, which is probably what the late Bronze Age collapse is. And you realize that if you're Colin Renfrew working in the late 70s and you're defining a systems collapse, one is that you've got a so-called dark age afterward, in which people are looking back at the golden age and reminiscing, and hello Homer, right, and hello Hesiod. So I'm like, yeah, okay. So, and that poor Hesiod, I wish that I were not living in an age of iron. And like, yeah, you are. Deal with it. So right.
Oh, the idea of poor Hesiod. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, this is the perfect way to dive a little deeper into, all the different kind of things that went into it. So, you mentioned the wars of the in the Hittite record, and like what are some? I'm trying to think of a better way of phrasing a question, but I'm just so curious in all the different, I suppose, records. I'm quite interested in the records that we have that give us some sense of what was happening, and if it can be tied later to myths that come out, I mean, even better. But I'm just so curious in what the records say, because I know obviously we're dealing with so many different different bits and pieces when it comes to how we learn about this collapse. But in terms of what they were writing, like what do we know?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because in addition to all the archaeology where we've gone and we've dug up the cities, and yes, this one's destroyed, no, this one isn't, and this one gets hit by an earthquake, this one gets hit by humans, we do have a lot of written records, as you say, but they differ from society to society, which is probably not surprising, and they differ in the amount of information we can get for them, and in how much we can trust them at face value versus exaggeration. So, for instance, we don't have nearly as much information from the Mycenaeans, because they're writing in Linear B, and their clay tablets are concerned with accounting from the palaces. So they're talking about how many chariot wheels you've got and how many sheep. They do not, perhaps surprisingly, talk about, and we traded with Egypt and we traded with Cyprus. There's actually no real mention of trade or anything like that in the Linear B text.
Really? I was totally wrong about that. Oh, that's so interesting. I knew it was all palace records. But
yeah, it's all palace records.
Yeah.
What we do have though, are like the names of items where the foreign name comes with the foreign item, some of which might surprise you. I mean, there's a name of a spice, cyperus, which may or may not come from Cyprus. It's not spelled quite the same, but the word for ivory comes from the Hittite. The word for gold, the word for chiton. I mean, a lot of these things come from the Near East. The word for sesame, sasama, in Linear B comes directly out of Akkadian and all of that. So, and we have the names of a couple of people. There's one guy named Apikutio, the Egyptian, and he's in charge of like 80 sheep at Knossos. Like, why is a guy named the Egyptian in charge? So, anyway, so the Linear B tablets from mainland Greece and Knossos are not as much help as you might expect. On the other hand, the Hittite records, as I mentioned, talk about wars, conflicts, problems with an area in northwestern Anatolia, modern Turkey, in a region called Asawa. And Asawa seems to be a confederation of like 22 cities and states. And in fact, the word Asawa gave rise to Asia. That's where we get the name Asia from. And in among the 22 cities and towns is one called Tarusa, and another Wilusa. Wilusa seems to be the name for Troy, for the Hittites. And Tarusia or Tarusa is apparently the area around. It's like the Troad versus Troy.
Right.
But, in Greek, we've got Troy, which is Ilios, of course, and there would have been a digamma originally, so it would have been like a W. It would have been Wilios, and the W drops out over time.
Right.
Wilios in Greek, Wilusa in Hittite. Hello, it's Troy. So they're talking about, as I say, about four conflicts starting back in the 15th century BC. So I'm actually wondering if the Trojan War stories that come down to us from Homer and the epic cycle might not be telescoping of 200 or 300 years of on-again, off-again conflict. At any rate, the Hittite records also talk about the fact that there is drought and famine towards the end of the Late Bronze Age. And they talk about campaigns that their kings do. We know from archaeology that they've actually abandoned their capital city of Hattusa just before the end. So when part of it's burnt, it's already abandoned. So we've got some info from the Hittite records. The Egyptians, of course, are useful, and that's where the Sea Peoples come from, because twice Pharaoh Merneptah in 1207 and Pharaoh Ramses III in 1177 BC, and that's where the title of my first book in this series came from. They talk about a coalition attacking Egypt twice within 30-year period. We call them the Sea Peoples. That's the name that the French Egyptologists came up with. But the Egyptians actually tell us their names: the Peleset, the Denyen or Danuna, the Shardana or Sheridan, the Shekelesh, And so we've been playing linguistic games with them. Are the Shardana or the Shurdan from Sardinia, for example? Are the Shekelesh from Sicily? Are the Danuna or Denyan, is that Homer?
That's what I was, that was my thought.
Right.
Sounds a lot like Danians.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And actually in the earlier wave, there's a group called the Ekwesh, or the Ekwesh the Achaeans. And so do we have one group from the Aegean coming in 1207 and another group coming in 1177, and the Egyptians, who don't know better, call one wave the Ekwesh and the next wave the Danuna or Denyan. So anyway, the only group that we think we can actually identify is the Peleset. Those are the Philistines. And in the Hebrew Bible, it claims the Philistines come from Crete, from Kaftor. So, there may be something to that. Now, the Egyptians say that they beat these sea peoples both times. But, can you take the Egyptian records at face value?
Are they going to say when they lost?
Exactly. Do the Egyptians ever say when they lost? I mean,
we got beat really badly. Like, they're not going to write that.
No, even the Battle of Kadesh, which was a draw back in about 1274, that we know, we know it was a stalemate, but the Egyptians claim a victory. So do the Hittites, for that matter, but never mind. So, one place that has provided really interesting records is the site of Ugarit, a port city on what is now the north coast of Syria. And there we have archives from 3 or 4 different private merchants who were also working for the palace. And they talk about life, on the one hand, going on just as per normal, right up until the end. I mean, there's even one guy who's sending his ships back and forth to Crete. But then all of a sudden, we get reports of enemy ships being seen, that enemy troops have landed at Ras Ibn Hani, which is right there on the coast, and that troops are advancing towards Ugarit. And we know that Ugarit is destroyed by humans. There are arrowheads in the walls. There's 1 meter, 3 feet of destruction. And yet we don't know who the enemies are, because they just say the enemy. So from Ugarit, we then get an idea of the end and some of the other texts, and these were ones that have only just been published. They came out in French in 2016, and then an English translation published by Yuri Cohen in 2020, where the texts from Ugarit are talking about a famine, and that they're all dying, and that they're writing to the Pharaoh of Egypt, including Merneptah, the same guy as fought the Sea Peoples. And the king of Ugarit writes to Merneptah saying that we're dying here, there's a famine, can you send us anything? And interestingly, we're missing that letter, but we have Merneptah's response in which he quotes the letter. He says, you wrote to me saying X, Y, and Z. And so here, I'm happy to help. And he sends 7,000 dried fish plus beads and textiles. And I'm not sure how the beads and textiles would help the famine, but the dried fish went a long way, I'm sure. Yeah. So there we would have no reason to doubt it. It's not exaggeration. It's not a public record. It's a private letter between kings. And so that, for me, is a very useful textual source. So, like I say, we've got a number of different sources from different cities. The question is, how much can we take at face value? And how much can we say, okay, that really was the situation? But I would love to have more. For instance, we don't have anybody writing contemporaneously saying, help, help, the sky is falling, we're collapsing. Oh, send help, we've got earthquakes. We don't have that. We do have people saying, we're being invaded, send reinforcements. But, was anybody aware at that time that they were collapsing and wrote about it? Was there somebody, who was it, Clytemnestra, that was, predicting the future, or other people
Cassandra,
like that? Was there anybody like that, and a soothsayer, And, was she ignored? So we don't have that, unfortunately. But we do have a lot of information.
Yeah. It's really interesting that what the textual sources we do have don't talk about the natural disasters that we know were happening. Like, I have a real pet obsession with the eruption of Thera, just because I love a good volcanic eruption. Like, they're just fascinating. And I went to Akrotiri a couple years ago, and just, game changer.
Yeah.
And it is fascinating that, I mean, I know that it's considerably earlier, than when
Right.
things are collapsing, but I know, but still, that there were earthquakes happening so often. And it's interesting that they don't ever, write that down. Of course, I think probably a big problem with this time period and the writings is that they were much more practical than they were later. The writing was much more about whether it was going to be useful versus like recording things for posterity.
Right, exactly. And they weren't busy doing that. That is
Mm-hmm.
for sure. But we do know that there's a period of about 50 years when there's earthquakes back then, and earthquake storm, as Amos North from Stanford has called them. And they're affecting many of the cities at the time, including Troy. We know that Troy 6 is destroyed by earthquakes. So then there's another earthquake at Kom el Hatan in Egypt, where Amenhotep III's palace was, and at Mycenae, maybe at Tiryns. That's a bit debated now, but yeah, we've got all that, and yet earthquakes were a big factor, and yet nobody's writing about them. Which okay, so it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though. The earth shakes. Like, you'd think you'd write it down or like say it to somebody, but I guess it's not necessary for any kind of record keeping, maybe. But it's interesting. So I feel like this is now just me being like a nerd for natural disasters, but like I feel like if there's an earthquake at Mycenae, they'd probably feel it at Tiryns. Like, it's not far.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You would think so. Right. And I realized I misspoke. Not Clytemnestra, of course. It's Cassandra who does all the prophesying, right? So, were there any Cassandras back then? I'm sure there were, but they didn't write their words down. So, and that's where the archaeology comes in, because as one of the books that I read when I was younger, the mute stones speak. We've got to get archaeology to tell its story. And it's wonderful when the written text can supplement it, and that's something that we especially find in the Iron Age, when you've got the Neo-Assyrian texts and all of that. But here at the end of the Late Bronze Age, we're I would say, so reliant on what the archaeologists are finding and how they interpret it. But that's why there's so much room for agreement and disagreements when you're looking at the same data, and two people can see two different stories there. But we definitely have tons of evidence for the Late Bronze Age, some written and some not.
Well, and I know, when it comes to writing, especially during this period, we're really dealing with the elites, right? The people who have the ability not only to write, but to have it preserved. And I think that that's something that, if you're just coming to this as an outsider, like interested in the subject, it's harder to remember, because now anyone can write something down and have it preserved. But back then, like, there's a lot that has to go into something not only being recorded, but surviving for us today. And that does mean that it is really the people, the rich people, the elites in power that can do that.
Exactly. And that is very much a problem from back then. And that was some of the comments that I got on the first book, including in some reviews. He's telling the story of the 1%. What about the 99%? And my response is, yeah, what about them? I'd love to be able to talk about them. Show me the evidence, and that even after the collapse, in the aftermath in the Iron Age, again, and what I say in the sequel that's just about to come out, the after 1177 BC, in the front of the book, in the preface and the prologue, I explicitly say, I can only report what I know. I can only report what we found in archaeology or from the written text. And in the case, and I give the example of the Neo-Assyrians, they're talking about the king and the administration. They're talking about the 1%. I said, so I can't really tell you what it was like for a peasant out in the hinterlands unless somebody has gone and excavated it. So I say, unfortunately, this is the story of the elite, and I just can't tell you the story of the unnamed millions out there, much as I would want to do that. So our hands are tied by the evidence that's been left to us. That's for sure. And the least we can do is acknowledge that and say, there's a lot that remains untold.
Well, I imagine the archaeological record does give us certainly more when it comes to, some level of normalcy. Like, obviously not deep out in the country unless you suddenly figure out where to excavate and can manage it. But in terms of, even the palatial structures and stuff, the archaeology would I imagine, give us some idea of what a slightly more normal person lived like.
Assuming somebody has found a site and excavated it. Absolutely. Right. But even there, it's we're at the mercy of our technology to a certain degree. I mean, it used to be thought that in the aftermath of the Bronze Age on the Greek mainland that between 70 and 90% of the people had died or had migrated. We've now lowered that. A maximum 60% died or migrated, maybe more like 40%. Sarah Murray and Ian Morris have suggested the population plummeted from 600,000 down to about 330,000 people on the Greek mainland. But part of the reason why we've ratcheted it back and said, oh, it wasn't 90% that died, it's only 40%, is because now we're finding more Iron Age sites that we hadn't been able to find before. Right. And so with every new site, you're like, okay, more people survived or whatever. So again, keep in mind that when we're calling something like the aftermath of the collapse a dark age, it's frequently a reference to the fact that we don't know what happened. It's dark to us, which is why you've got so many scholarly articles where the title is New Light on the Dark Age. New light. It's like eventually there's enough light. It's not a dark age anymore. And in fact, I don't think that the Iron Age is a dark age. And that's what a lot of scholars are arguing now. The problem is that the general public doesn't know that yet. So you still see the centuries after the late Bronze Age collapse, like 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, even down into the 8th, still called the world's first dark age. I mean, even the PR for 1177 talked about the aftermath being the world's first dark age.
Yeah.
So in the sequel, at the end, I make the argument, and I agree with my colleagues that say, stop calling this a dark age. Just like the Middle Ages, they don't want theirs called a dark age anymore. Same with us. So I'm in the camp that says, can we just call it the Iron Age, which is accurate, doesn't cause, cast any aspersions. But so anyway, so it's part of how much we know. And that's where the technology that archaeologists are using, including remote sensing and better surveying techniques and all that, is, if you'll excuse me, shedding more light on this period.
No, I think it's really important to emphasize that. Like, it's something that I've been aware of in writing this, of, both noting that it used to be called, and it's still sometimes called a dark age, but all the reasons why that's not really applicable and just is misleading, because I think that people do really consider a dark age more to be about, like, what is happening versus this idea of a lack of sources. And that's really applicable to the Middle Ages too, where, people consider it a dark age as in terms of, like, human intellect and stuff. And that's just, it's very unfortunate for the people that were living then. And I think about that with the Iron Age a lot, because the Iron Age is when we get the development of everything that I certainly obsess over when it comes to ancient Greece. Like, they weren't doing nothing. They weren't some suddenly dumbed down group of people. Like, just a lot of things changed and they stopped, recording things in the same way. And so we don't know. But that doesn't mean it wasn't happening.
Exactly. It doesn't mean it wasn't happening, and it doesn't mean they weren't trying their best. And Even a dark age. It's not, the total collapse and degeneration with wild dogs howling and, people. And I do talk about this towards the end of the sequel, but we're going to get the standardization of the alphabet, courtesy of the Phoenicians, who then bring it over to Greece and to Italy, for that matter. And so our people in Greece are going to be able to start writing, certainly by the 8th century, and maybe even earlier. There's some new research that is debating whether the alphabet made it over as early as the 11th century, which I'm in total favor of, because that's when it gets standardized over in the Near East. And why would Greece be 300 years behind? No, bring it on over. And, we've got, I think, at some point, there's 33 different variations of the early alphabet, so they're experimenting. So yeah, this is a time of innovation. It's the time of invention. And not only do you get the standardization of the alphabet, you also get iron. I mean, it gives the name to this. You get the invention of iron, which is probably courtesy of the Cypriots, it's looking like right now. And they're making bimetallic knives and weapons where the blade is made of iron and the hilt, inlaid with bone or wood or ivory, but fastened on with rivets made of bronze. So you've got both bronze and iron. And it looks like the Cypriots are kind of making the transformation from the segue, if you will, from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And that on Cyprus, they've been working with copper all this time. And now they move into iron. And along with the exportation of these objects, both to Greece and the southern Levant, it looks like they're also exporting the know-how, the technology. And then, of course, you've got iron ore in every country. And so everybody's then able to make it. So this is a period of invention, innovation, transformation. And one thing that I take a look at in this sequel, I borrow the adaptive cycle, which is something you frequently see in environmental studies, biology and such. But the basic idea is, empires rise and fall, right? That's the adaptive cycle. You get a release phase, and then you get an innovation phase, and then everything comes back. I think that's what we're looking at here. The Bronze Age collapse is the release phase, the omega phase in an adaptive cycle. And then the Iron Age, not a dark age, but it's the alpha phase, which is defined as a period of invention and innovation, trying to grapple with what's just happened. And I think that's the perfect analogy right here. So it's almost the opposite of a dark age. And in fact, some scholars like John Papadopoulos and Sarah Morris at UCLA have argued that this is not a dark age. It's far from it. And so have some of the people that are studying the Near East. So I'm just literally jumping on the bandwagon and agreeing with you that this is a time of invention and innovation. It's actually a very exciting time. I mean, I'm a Bronze Age person. That's where my heart lies. But I have to admit that the Iron Age is pretty darn interesting. So I'll give them that.
Well, I'm really big on the classical and archaic, so we can kind of find the middle ground there in the iron. But I mean, it's so interesting to me that it's ever been called the Dark Age, because regardless of what we did or did not know, like what we've known for a long time is that it did give rise to the oral tradition that would become like the Homeric epics. Like the idea of referring to the time when those were being created, as a Dark Age is so ironic, given that so much of quote unquote Western civilization has been attributed to the Greeks, like during and from that. It was like, why? Like there's just so much kind of happening there that seems contradictory.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you think back too, the Greeks themselves never talked about a dark age.
No,
that's as James Whitley once said, the Dark Age of Greece is our own conception. And, and that's where, again, John Papadopoulos said the Greeks didn't know of a dark age. Why not trust their better judgment? And I'm like, yes, why not trust their better judgment? Right. So, yeah, I would absolutely agree. Any age that's got everyone from Homer to Hesiod to Sappho and onward, is not, in my mind, a dark age.
Yeah, yeah. They're giving us amazing stuff that we all still love. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Now,
Right.
the alphabet that you mentioned, the sort of new research coming through about when it was, happening in Greece. Was that some of the stuff that's been published recently about on Andros? I noticed that there was something that recently came out about that.
Yeah, I don't know if it is or not. I'd have to look. But I'm thinking of the research that Wilhelmina Wall has been publishing out of, I think she's at Leiden, but doing really interesting work on the origins of the alphabet. But yeah, this is new stuff, really. And there's a couple of Greek archaeologists working on this as well. So I don't know what the pushback is going to be from the actual philologist or linguist or anything like that. But from an archaeological point of view, looking at the earliest Phoenician alphabet and the earliest inscriptions and in Greece, I think we can push it back further. But like Borioyannis has been talking about this. Anyway, the field is definitely alive and well, and I think it may shake up some of the tried and true things that we've been teaching for years. So, I mean, there are other things that we're going to shake up. I mean, I start my book by dismissing the Dorian Invasion.
Lovely. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, there's nothing here. It didn't happen.
Okay,
There's
so just no.
No,
Great.
just no, exactly. All the maps that have the Dorians coming down, I'm like, no, exactly. So I actually start the book with that. I end the book pleading for no dark ages. It's an Iron Age. I begin the book with the Dorians. In fact, I start out with the Dorians came down from the north, brandishing their weapons of iron. They overran Greece and took over, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then I pause, figurative, literally, and then say, but it probably never happened. And what? Wait, that's a good way to open the book, right? Right? So, yeah, but it probably never happened. The problem is that you see it all over the internet. Yeah. You see it in online encyclopedias, and I actually call out one or two by name in the book with the link. So, which means that I'm pretty sure within 3 weeks of the book appearing in mid-April that the online encyclopedias will have changed their entry, and either the link will be dead or they will have changed it to not say what I've got. So I've got screenshots. I've got the receipts, right? But yeah, they still talk about the Dorians coming sweeping down from the north at about 1200 BC and ending Mycenaean civilization. And I'm like, no. And I reach back and quote scholars all the way back to like Rhys Carpenter in the 60s, saying things like the Dorian invasion is a mirage, that it's an invasion without invaders, that everything they're supposed to bring with them is already there and can't be attributed to them. So, I think it's like Herodotus and Thucydides were trying to, in a way, make this up so they could explain the dialects of Greece, Ionic versus Doric versus whatever. But archaeologically speaking, there's no evidence for it. Now, of course, we do have the problem with evidence of absence, or absence of evidence is not, and all that, right? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We can't find the Dorian invasion. One could argue that doesn't mean it didn't exist. I do think it didn't exist. What we've got instead, how about if it's not an invasion, but it's a migration? We do have people moving back and forth at that time, not a problem. But there is a world of difference between a migration and an invasion. Two very different things. So I start out the book saying, if we're wrong about the Dorian invasion, and we have to change our textbooks because they're in the textbooks. I mean, the textbook that I was using for my ancient Mediterranean civilizations class, it's got 1.5 pages, 2 pages on the Dorian invasion. And I would tell my freshmen, because it's a freshman class, I would say, rip those pages out of the textbook because that's wrong, right? Or if we're going to discuss it, let's discuss it. But so it's still around, and we just have to let the general public know that stuff is not right. So, there's another episode for you. Yes, but or no, not so much. The Dorian Invasion, did it happen? No, right? But again, this is not news to scholars, but it is news to the general public. And everywhere I look on the internet, they're like, and I'm fully expecting that after the sequel comes out, we'll see a whole other slew of podcasts of people mansplaining why the Dorian invasion either happened or didn't happen, and taking credit for everything that we've done. But anyway, there's lots of, I guess one could say, myths and legends about this period, some of which are accurate and some of which just aren't, and we got to figure out which is which.
It's funny. I'm trying to think of, because I really don't touch on history too much as outside of the kind of classical period history surrounding the playwrights, because I love them, and they talk about myths. But so I've touched into history a couple of times on the show, in my own research, and one of them was last year. I did a series on Sparta, and it was broadly about the the Spartan mirage. Sort of the myths that Sparta created for themselves.
Right.
And I think that's the only time I've ever touched on the Dorian invasion, and I'm trying to remember what I said, but I from what I remember of looking into it, it felt to me more like a Spartan myth than it did history. Yeah. And so I'm hoping that that's kind of where I landed at the time, because that's what it felt like. It's just like another of the things that the Spartans kind of mythologized about themselves, and that kind of took it sort of caught hold and lasted.
Yeah, I would agree. I would absolutely agree that it was part of the Spartan mirage, all the stuff that Paul Cartledge and other people talk about. And yeah, the Dorians are part and parcel of that. They were very important for the Spartans. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And in my History of Ancient Greece course, when I teach it, I say the exact same thing. I touch on it as well.
Yeah, I feel like I thought it was a myth. Well, clearly I didn't. I don't know. Now I'm fascinated. But yeah, I mean, it always seemed unlikely to me. Like, why? It just, it feels like an unlikely explanation for what happened. And
well, the thing is, unlikely or not, I mean, the Dorian invasion, it could happen. It's very much like the Sea Peoples. I mean, in the original 1177 book, I start with the Sea Peoples. And so now in the sequel, I thought, okay, let me start with the Dorians. And so we have the same sort of questions. Like, if the Sea Peoples actually did invade like the Egyptians, then why couldn't the Dorians have invaded also? Right? And one could ask that. And part of the problem is that for the Dorians, as I said, there's no archaeological evidence. For the Sea Peoples, there's no archaeological evidence either. We can't find them anywhere. We do have textual evidence, right? And that's part of the problem. The Shardana or the Shurden, they're mercenaries. We see them fighting in the Near East, both for Egypt and against Egypt, from like the 14th century on. They're known quantities. And yet, point me to a site anywhere that you can say this is where the Shardana come from, right? In Sardinia or wherever. There isn't one yet, right? And even Ugarit, where they talk about the enemy ships showing up, they don't say the Shardana. There is one text that mentions a Shardana, but so we've got the same sort of thing for the Sea Peoples and for the Dorians. And so I guess one could ask, and I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but why do we accept the Sea Peoples and not the Dorians? Well, the Sea Peoples, I now think, are, as I mentioned, are part of the equation in terms of being victims as opposed to oppressors. They are migrating because of a drought. And I would have no problem with the Dorians doing that as well. I have no problem with the Dorians migrating at the end of the Late Bronze Age. I just don't want the Dorians invading. And similarly, I'm not so sure the Sea Peoples invaded per se. I think they are migrating. And we've got evidence, especially in the southern Levant now, for the Philistines, who are part of the Sea Peoples, as having been a much more peaceful assimilation into the region than one would expect. So maybe that's the answer. And I guess what I'm doing in both books is arguing for a migration rather than an invasion for both the Sea Peoples and the Dorians. And I think that explains the evidence we've got It explains some of the tics that we've got, and it doesn't do away with them completely. It just massages it slightly to fit the evidence that we've got. So, you want to call it a Dorian migration? I'm cool. Call it a Dorian invasion? I'm not so sure about that. But, again, but this is nuances. This is semantics. And, somebody out in the general populace is going to say, invasion, migration, whatever. I'm like, no, not whatever. Let's talk about it.
Well, and I'm so glad that you brought it up that way, because I think, one of the things that we've been really trying to drill in this whole series is the way that the ancient Mediterranean was broadly about migration. Like, the way that, it wasn't about, this group of people lived in this land and only in this land, and they are the indigenous peoples, and across the Mediterranean, it was a very shared space. There was a lot of going back and forth, a lot of migration, especially if we're dealing with drought and other like climate change things that would force people to migrate. And I think that especially because of the myth of Western civilization, we have this idea that like ancient Greece existed in a little bubble, a little vacuum of like just them, and they were very Greek and they started everything. And it's like, even the ancient Greeks are like, well, the Phoenicians gave us the alphabet, and Aphrodite probably came from Cyprus, and they give us so much evidence for migration, both of culture and language and people, that I think it really is important to remind everyone that this wasn't like set, migration happened a lot, and a lot of different people from different places lived together in the same place quite peacefully and quite happily, and it wasn't always about an invading force. Like, I think we think about it because of later colonialism. We imagine that if there is a large group of people, it is always going to be an invading force. And I think that that's a really important myth to break, and really just point out all the evidence that suggests that that's not really what was happening broadly.
I agree. And if you look closely at the Sea People's inscriptions in Egypt, the one I'm thinking of, Ramses III, and his inscription on his wall at Medinet Habu, in addition to a scene of the naval battle between the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples, he's got right next to it a scene of the Sea Peoples literally migrating. You see the women and the children sitting on an ox cart, with their Samsonite luggage in the cart with them. It's a migration. It's not a bunch of men hopped up on testosterone just raiding. It's an entire family migrating, and we see the picture. So I actually said in the original book that I thought that the analogy for the Sea Peoples would be the Dust Bowl in the 1930s in the United States, where the people moved from Oklahoma to California. More recently, I would say the people fleeing the civil war in Syria would be the equivalent of Sea Peoples. They're just looking for a better home where they're, not in the middle of a war zone. People migrating, trying to get to Europe, for example. These are all, I would say, examples where I wouldn't call that an invasion per se. I would call it a migration. And I think it's the same at the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. We definitely have evidence for lots of migration, not just in Greece, but elsewhere as well. That may be where the kingdoms of like Moab and Ammon and even Edom, even people, they're either migrating or they're nomadic at the time, at the end of the Late Bronze Age. And of course, I think it was Herodotus that talks about the Etruscans migrating from Anatolia because of a drought in about 1200 BC. So, there you go. There's your Herodotus talking about a drought and a migration at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Whether it's accurate or not, who knows? But
sure, but when they're writing it into their myths or their, history, or what Herodotus wanted to be history, like it still is coming from somewhere. It's I just recently read yesterday somebody, it was a whole thing on Twitter, but essentially it was like this the notion that Rome was like not a city of immigrants, which is so absurd. And Rome obviously, like, yes, you know, I won't pretend that the Aeneid is not Augustan propaganda, but the idea of Romans coming from Troy, like, had to have come from somewhere. Even if they just imagined themselves as a city of immigrants, that's an incredibly important, like, cultural tradition that they established for themselves. And I think that it's really important to point this stuff out, because today our modern ideas are so based in, like, fear mongering and all these different things about migrants, and, you know, it's like, it's just horrible stuff. And I think that often, especially, like, you know, just what I call history bros, but I appreciate that you call them mansplainers of these, like, you know, the YouTuber guys.
Yeah.
And it like, I think that mentality comes into that kind of telling of this idea of invasions instead of migrations, and it just kind of perpetuates these problems that we have in the modern world, and which have, like, you know, really, really important modern issues attached to them, but then are being put on the ancient world. And when we put that kind of stuff on the ancient world, it almost gives legitimacy to the actions of today, right? This suggestion that, oh, well, it was an invasion and it was bad and they fought back, or whatever it is, you know.
Right,
but yeah, whereas a lot of it was migration. Not to say that they weren't having wars, obviously, but, like, it's important to point out what things are migrations versus invasions.
Absolutely, and I think that's where a lot of the what did you just call them? The history bros on YouTube.
Yeah.
They lose or they never knew the nuances.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the saying? The devil's in the details.
Mm-hmm.
So the nuances matter at this
Absolutely.
point. Yeah, absolutely. So especially if you're commenting and trying to compare the modern world to the ancient world, you know, you need to have the facts straight. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the people on YouTube, let's just say, do not have their facts completely in order.
No, yeah, it's not the best. I mean, not to say that there aren't some good work being put out there, but unfortunately, the loudest ones tend to be the ones that are the most wrong.
Right. Yes, there are some very good ones. I should not lump everybody together, but
yeah,
there are others where you would definitely want a yes, but, or a no, not so much.
Well, sensationalizing gets you views, unfortunately, right? It's like all the documentaries that we see that have utter nonsense infused in them, because sensational is exciting. So
it is. It is.
I would love to hear more about you know, what's happening at this period beyond Greece, because obviously I focus mostly on Greece, but I want, you know, we've talked a little about the Hittites and the Egyptians, which is wonderful, but I know a lot was happening more further inland, wasn't it? Like, even into Mesopotamia and stuff. Were they having, like, a similar kind of collapse or their own version?
Yes and no, and this is where this is, first of all, where it gets very interesting, but also where the sequel becomes even more important. So, on the face of it, at the end of the Late Bronze Age, you know, everyone goes down. Actually, what happens is it's the network that goes down, the globalized Mediterranean network, as Susan Sherritt and others have called it, the ones that are linking everybody, where nobody is more than 3 hops away from anybody else, so that it's a small world network. That network collapses at the end of the Late Bronze Age. The links are cut. The actual societies are each affected in different ways, and that's what I'm exploring in the sequel.
Oh, wonderful.
So, but that's where it comes in, because at the end of the Late Bronze Age, on the surface of it, it looks like the Assyrians and the Babylonians do better than many of the other people. And indeed, they're all the way in inland Mesopotamia, as you said. They're on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They are too far inland to be hit by the sea peoples. They, at first at least, don't seem to have been hit by the drought and the famine, maybe because they're on Tigris and Euphrates. And in other words, they seem to have survived better. Well, as it turns out, and I go into this in the sequel, the answer is yes and no. They do survive longer, at least at first, without the drought and without the famine. They're not impacted immediately. They're not impacted necessarily at 1177 like the others, nor do they have to fight or anything like that. But they do keep records, and this is what's nice, is that they don't collapse. It's not a systems collapse. They still have the king, they still have the administration, they still have the economy, they still have the standing army, they still know how to write, right? They haven't lost civilization per se. They're definitely not in a dark age. But we are missing royal records for about 75 years at that period. There just aren't any. Right? They're still around, but we don't have records. We don't know why. Are they writing on some other material or whatever? And then when we do start getting records again, about 75 years into it, down at about, say, 1100 BC, they start saying, we now have a drought. We now have famine. We are now resorting to cannibalism. So they do get hit. But it's like almost 100 years later than anybody else. But what happens is they also rebound because they never lose everything entirely. And so by the 9th century, the Neo-Assyrians are not only back up and running, but they're busy conquering all of the ancient Near East. In fact, one thing that has changed, back in the Bronze Age, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they were good commercial partners. They were trading with everybody else, right? We even have Minoan sandals that are sent over to Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century.
That's adorable. I don't know why. It's so cute.
It is cute, but it's even better because he didn't like them and he returned them. And it tells us that in the records.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, why did he return them? Are they too small? Too last millennium? But anyway, so the Assyrians and the Babylonians in the Bronze Age were good, dependable trading partners.
Yeah.
Now, in the aftermath of the collapse, the people that the Assyrians and Babylonians were trading with, many of them had collapsed. Right? The Assyrians go down, the Mycenaeans go down. What the Neo-Assyrians do when they come back up in the 9th century is they start attacking and taking the stuff. Whereas before they'd be like, look, I'll give you this for this and this for this. Now they're like, give me what you got, right? Give me what you got. And they are either demanding in tribute or actually capturing everything. So that changes in the Iron Age is the nature of the relationships with the Assyrians and Babylonians. So, it's changed a little bit, and what's happening in the Iron Age is quite different in some ways from the Bronze Age. But I would say that's where the combination of doing the research for the first book, 1177 BC, added to the research for the second book, the after 1177 BC, has given me and hopefully the readers a more nuanced look at what happened before, during, and after the collapse. So not just in terms of resilience and everything, but in how the different relationships were affected. So one of the things that I say in the sequel is the collapse of the Late Bronze Age is messy. The aftermath is even more messy.
I mean, makes sense.
Yeah, it
when
does.
Something that big goes down, it's going to leave a mess behind.
This is true. And it's interesting. But, again, from the archaeology and the textual records, we only have bits and pieces. So I compare it to a kaleidoscope where you're looking through and you've got all these pieces. And sometimes they can form a picture. And other times they're just, disjointed fragments. And we've got to put them all together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You can kind of see how culture would kind of get to that point if they're having their drought and famine late, and they've seen that everyone else has kind of fallen around them. Like I can see how a mentality would develop of like, well, if we can't do the trading, like, but we're also the ones who kind of stayed the strongest as everyone else crumbled. Like the immediate reaction, that kind of time period, is to be like, well, I guess we'll take what we, used to trade for, right?
Absolutely. We've still got our standing army. You don't. We're just going to come and take your stuff. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they used to have diplomacy, but it wasn't possible anymore, and
right.
It's so interesting. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting how much being inland can help, and it makes sense. Like even just in terms of like the natural, the earth factors. It is such a different place compared to like when you're right on the coast of the Mediterranean. And
exactly, but look, the Phoenicians who were on the coast. Look, they were able to take advantage. And in contrast to the Neo-Assyrians, the Phoenicians are busy trading with everybody. You don't see, the Phoenicians conquering. You don't.
Okay, so so they're still doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you do eventually get the Phoenician colonization, just like you get Greek colonization. Right. And so you get, the Phoenicians on Cyprus, you get the Phoenicians founding Carthage and all of that. And there would be obviously some military to go with that, but some of the earliest evidence we have them as, I would say, more peaceful maritime ventures in which they're going out and trading for what they need, including as far west as Spain. So, but, then eventually you can't blame them. I don't know, maybe you could blame them. Just like Greece, in the Archaic period and the colonizing period, they start sending out, in the Greeks' case, start sending out their excess population. And so we get the Phoenicians expanding that way too. But again, at first, I like to imagine it much more peaceful. We got this, you got that, we need it, let's go, as opposed to the Assyrians with, you got that, we want it, give it to us. But again, one thing I would hasten to add is that we're coming at this from the Neo-Assyrian written records for the most part. And I do not know that we can take them all or most or any at face value. Because again, the Neo-Assyrians are very much like the Egyptians. Neo-Assyrians never lose a battle. They always win. They always conquer. They always take loot, and really? Actually?
Yeah. Is that likely, just, statistically?
Exactly. So, and there is some intimation that in some of the battles, like when the Assyrians and the Babylonians are fighting, that the Assyrians may have lost a couple of times. But again, this is where we have to be careful of taking ancient inscriptions at face value, especially when they're obviously being used as propaganda, when they're put up on blocks in the king's palace for people to see, where he's definitely boasting. I mean, there's one of my favorite inscriptions. He calls himself a stormtrooper. And I'm thinking, oh, you're in Star Wars? Huh? Yeah. You're a stormtrooper? Okay, that's pretty cool. Right? So,
yeah. What would the word be? Like, what would be like a more literal definition that then we could call it a stormtrooper?
This is a good question. I'd have to go back and look at the actual Akkadian and see. But he does call himself a stormtrooper and compares his opponents to little desert rodents hopping away as he comes after them. So, okay, fine. So,
well, maybe we don't take that fully as truth,
Exactly. So this is part of the problem, and this is again what I say towards the beginning of the book is not only do I only have the information from the top 1% and don't really know how the bottom is doing, except in some cases where they give us like annual crop yields, which are sometimes in the records. But I also can't say for sure that we can take this at 100% believability. Are they gaslighting us? Are they exaggerating? Did you really kill that many, wild bulls? Right, and so on.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's so interesting, especially the textual record stuff. Like, I think about that, when it comes to just even mythology, right? Like we still only, even when it comes to mythology, we still only have the stuff that not only they back then deemed, worthy of being written down. But then whoever, in the last 1,000 years or the 1,000 years that followed decided to keep it and record it again and long enough for us to have it. There's so much missing.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember, the nuance of what we do have and also what's possible that we don't have.
Right. Exactly. Too much information. It's a plethora. It's a smorgasbord. Yeah.
I feel like, okay, I'm going to look at I have some questions from Michaela just as we, get closer to the time. I'm sure we've kind of touched on a number of these things, but are there any, really big misconceptions about the Bronze Age and its collapse that you feel like are very relevant and we haven't talked about already?
Yes. So the biggest misconception about the collapse that we haven't talked about, but that you touched upon, not in relation to this, but you like volcanoes. You like the eruption of Santorini. And, and who doesn't like a good eruption, right? Yeah, right. The biggest misconception is that the eruption of Santorini contributed to the late Bronze Age collapse. I see that everywhere. I still see it everywhere. Even though we've managed to hammer home to some degree the idea that the eruption of Santorini was back in the 16th century, maybe the 15th at the latest, but somewhere between 1628 and 1550. And the collapse is at 1200. So that's, 350, 400 years. Santorini had nothing to do with the late Bronze Age collapse. I know. But I'm still seeing the history bros. I like that. I'm going to start using that.
I'm very glad.
I'm still seeing them on the internet going, yeah, okay, fine, but it did impact Crete. And I'm like, yeah, and the Minoans bounced back. And they're like, but it could have had a centuries-long ripple effect. I'm like, coulda, didn't, And then others saying, well, maybe it exploded again. And I'm like, well, one scholar has suggested there might have been renewed activity in about 1200, but no, for me, that's the biggest misconception.
Yeah.
And when people are watching some of my lectures from back in 2016, the comments are like, he didn't even mention Santorini. And then I'm like, watch the Q&A because I dismiss it there. But so
there's a reason.
So I'd say that's the biggest misconception. Santorini and the eruption has nothing to do with the late Bronze Age collapse.
Fair. All right, I'll take it.
Okay.
And then, sorry, now I'm looking at my questions again. Usually I just go with whatever I'm thinking about. Do you think that there's anything in this period that is not getting, the attention that it deserves?
Do I think things aren't getting the attention? Well, yeah. I would say...
The question is broad.
Yeah, but no, I'm thinking of how to phrase this because on the one hand, most of the things that contributed to their collapse, I see around today. You can check the boxes off. Yes, climate change. Yes, drought. Yes, famine. Yes, earthquake. Yes, disease. Yes, invaders. Yes, migrants. We've got everything that they had back then. Plus, we've got, nuclear weapons. So
and human-made climate change.
And human-made climate change. And hello, they collapsed. The late Bronze Age came to an end. There's no question about that. Why you think we're not going to come to an end? I don't know. That's hubristic. Every civilization has either completely collapsed or had to transform so that it was basically not recognizable again. Why you think that's not going to happen to us? I have no idea. So
I think it's going to happen to us.
Right. I agree. I think it's not a matter of if, it's when. When is it going to happen?
Yeah. How fast are we going to let it happen by letting human-made climate change continue on? Yeah.
Yeah. Climate and think back to 2008 with the financial crisis on Wall Street. I mean, we came really close to having a globalized meltdown right there, but especially with the pandemic, I would say. And with climate change, that's my other worry. That's where I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the scientific evidence is showing that there was climate change back in the late Bronze Age. Scientific evidence is also showing there is climate change now. Why stick your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening? And this is one of the common sense things they come up with at the end of the sequel is, look, prepare for extreme weather events. Just go ahead and do it. We're seeing it all the time anyway. If you prepare for it and an extreme weather event does not occur, fine, not a big deal. If you prepare for it and it does occur, good. Now you're in a good position. So this was something I was interviewed by Adam Frank on NPR after the first volume came out. And I was happily blithering and blathering on about, well, the Hittites didn't know what was happening to them. They had climate change, and no, it wasn't caused by Hittite SUVs. It was Mother Nature.
They weren't pulling petroleum from the earth.
Exactly. But I said, we're much more advanced technologically and everything else, and we know all about climate change. We know what's causing the droughts and all that. And Adam Frank just said to me, yes, but are we advanced enough to do anything with our knowledge? And that I had no answer to. So that is something I would point to again. I don't think enough is being done. I think we're giving too much airtime to the naysayers. There's definitely climate change. Come on, people. Right? So what are we going to do about it? Let's do something. And if we're ready, we're ready. And if we need it, it's there. And if not, it's not. And, again, hello, late Bronze Age collapse. Look what happened to them. And hard on the heels of that is, okay, what about after collapse? What about resilience? What about transformation? Don't you understand? What about coping versus adapting? There's so many lessons from the ancient world if we're just willing to listen.
Yeah. I'm so thrilled. I'm so thrilled that this is, what you wanted to mention. And it is almost identical in a brilliant way to my conversation with Flint that will have aired just a few days before this. And honestly, like the way we as humanity are not doing enough about climate change is my pet obsession in my daily life. Like it's literally, I'm sure some of my friends would argue I talk about it too often. Like I am completely obsessed with how capitalism is a main reason why we just are not actively saving ourselves, because the money is in the stuff that's destroying us. And I didn't know that that's what this Bronze Age series was going to become, because I just had not learned enough about the climate change aspect of the collapse. So I'm just so thrilled that not only that it is this major talking point when it comes to this, but that so many people working on this and working in this field are connecting it to what's happening now in the way that you are. And it fills me with just a little bit more hope than I had before. Not enough hope, but some.
some hope.
Yeah.
A little hope is better than none.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, this is something I've made into a talking point on the show before. My show is more political than a mythology show probably needs to be, but it's just who I am as a person. And so it's like a fairly regular thing that I talk about, especially, in connection with the elites.
Right.
So it's been quite fun to be able to be like, oh, well, I'm going to just also be able to talk about climate change and a collapse of the elites when it comes to the ancient world. So that's nice.
Well, it also shows how relevant all of this is, that this isn't just ancient history. It's not just ancient mythology. It is relevant to us today. And, in part, that's part of the enduring legacy of myths and legends and all of that, is their continuing relevance. But in this particular case, it's relevant to whether or not we survive as a species, which I think is just a little bit important.
It's a tiny bit important. Yeah.
Yeah.
We might care. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Well, to kind of close on a slightly more upbeat question, is there anything or any particular, research field of study when it comes to this topic that you think is quite exciting, like new research that's being done or coming out? I know you touched upon some, adjustments to when we think the alphabet, which is very exciting, but, is there anything else that's kind of thrilling?
There's actually a lot, but
I hope so.
the one thing I would point to is the work with ancient DNA. That is so important, so interesting, and yet so fraught with potential problems. So, just to get the ancient DNA out of the ancient skeletons can be difficult, but then interpreting it also. So, on the one hand, we have great new stuff, like there were 4 Philistine infants that were excavated at Ashkelon underneath the floors of the houses. And those infants are probably the grandkids of the sea peoples who settled down in Canaan, because the genetics show, and I know genes don't work quite this way, but the little kids are like 40% local Canaanite and 60% from elsewhere. And the computer models indicate that the elsewhere is most likely to be either Crete or Spain or Sicily. And that's exactly where we thought the Philistines were coming from anyway. The kids have been identified in the houses as Philistine because of the pottery and everything else. But there the DNA matches. Of course, the problem is 4 kids is too small a sample. But still, it fit what we were already thinking. So that is interesting. The problem is when modern pundits and such get hold of the data and start saying things like, let's look at the DNA of Minoans and Mycenaeans and relate it to people in Greece today, and start making comparisons. So-and-so's always been here, so-and-so migrated in. This is where we have to be careful of, the proper interpretation of the actual results, and then B, how you use it, and maybe making it relevant or not, because you can.
Well, and the modern dangers of that.
Exactly.
That's dangerous.
Right, and the scientists are already pointing this out, that you've got oftentimes a huge difference between the actual scientific report that might come out in Nature or Science or something, and then the media's interpretation of it, where the article and the headline are almost clickbait, like you implied earlier. And I do that all the time, where I see something on the internet or somebody sends it to me, and I'm like, oh, that's sensational, interesting. But to their credit, even those articles usually have a hyperlink buried somewhere in the article, right? You have to look for the blue word. And you click on it, it takes you to the original publication in the scientific peer-reviewed journal, and you read that, you're like, oh, that's what they were saying. Yeah, that doesn't really match with what the media reported. So, and again, that's what we can learn, but the general public, they don't go and see the original. They just see the media report. And and even if we later, this happens all the time, if we later come out and say, yes, but we never get the bandwidth for our rebuttal that the original story had, right? Same thing with Atlantis,
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah, you never get to reach the same people or as many people. Yeah.
No.
Well, and I just think of the ways that kind of thing can be used to justify.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yet, this work with ancient DNA and the other, what people are calling the exact life sciences, this, as some of my colleagues have called it, this is the third wave in archaeology, where we're using all the new scientific stuff. And so I think the next couple of decades, the next generation in archaeology is going to be very exciting. And topics like the Bronze Age collapse and the aftermath are going to go along with that, and that we're going to have a lot more data coming in the future, such that, I don't know, I was thinking the other night, if the next generation is going to look back on what we're doing now and go, yeah, they were right about this, they were wrong about that. Always we can look back at our predecessors and go, yeah, right, wrong, right, wrong, right. No Dorian Invasion. Migration.
I was going to say,
yeah, exactly. Right. No dark ages, an Iron Age. So I wonder what, our students or the students of our students or the students of our students are going to say about our work at some point. But who knows?
Provided we solve climate change.
Provided we solve climate change. There is that, yes.
There have to be students of students of students.
One hopes.
Oh dear.
One hopes.
That's how I make my apparently lighthearted end question back into.
I was going to say, and that's ending on an upbeat note.
Yep, that's what I do. That's what I do here. Thank you so much for doing this. This was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much. I'm so excited. I'm a little annoyed that I can't talk about Thera, but that's okay. That's my fault.
We can do Thera. We can do Thera some other time. So
perfect.
Yes.
Well, just before we close up, do you want to tell my listeners, I mean, you've mentioned your books a couple of times, but I think this episode will be coming out on April 30th. So I think the sequel will be out. So if you want to tell my listeners, just like reiterate those titles and where they can buy them, which I imagine is everywhere. Yes,
certainly. So the sequel that is coming out on April 16th is called After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. And yes, that'll be available from Amazon, direct from Princeton University Press, or your local booksellers if you would like to support them. That will actually be coming out on the very same day as another publication. The original book was 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. And that came out from Princeton in 2014, with the revised edition, which is what people should read, that came out in 2021. Now, the other publication that's coming out on the same day as my sequel is the graphic version of the original, which is brilliant. It's drawn by Glynis Fox, who's an archaeologist and cartoonist, and she has essentially translated the original into another language, the language of cartoon and graphic version. The drawings are beautiful. It's huge. I mean, it is thick, heavy, glossy paper, beautiful drawings. And what she has done is translated my text into the story, told through the eyes of two young kids from that time period. We've got Pell, short for Peleset, a young boy about 12 years old, and his friend Shisha, again about 12 years old. She's Egyptian, and she is a scribe. She knows how to read and write. And the two of them are running around the Aegean and Mediterranean, trying to figure out why everything is collapsing and what has happened, and whether Grandpa, Pell's grandpa, who was a sea person, what he actually did in the battles. And so you see it through the eyes of the kids. But you also have both me and Glynis parachuting in from time to time up in the corner of the panel, telling the reader things that the two kids could not possibly have known. Right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, well, when Schliemann came here, he did this. And so, so it's basically 4 new characters introduced. It is so compelling. It's so wonderful. I'm so excited about it. And I'm hoping we get a whole new readership, everybody from age 7 to 70, you know, especially like if you don't like to read, but you like comic books, this is it for you. And if you're too young or you have only just started reading, you can, you know, there's the pretty pictures. And anyway, and you can play Where's Waldo with, you know, with me and with Glynis.
Yeah.
And anyway, so those two, both the sequel and the graphic version of the original, will come out mid-April, and I'm very excited about both of them. So thanks for the opportunity to mention them.
Oh, I'm thrilled. I've seen photos you've posted, I think, the cover of the graphic, and it looked like gorgeous. So I'm thrilled to know what's inside. And I mean, it sounds like it'll be really beneficial broadly, but I know there's also a lot of people who just learn visually, you know, and I think that that's so beneficial for so many people. That's great. And also just fun. Like, who doesn't love a fun little graphic novel version?
It is. And she really, it's interesting. In order to put it in the graphic version, she distilled it. So, you know, it's got the most essential 25% of the original text, you know, that kind of thing. So the process was fascinating. And she and I did a webinar the other day in which she walked the viewers through her process of drawing. Oh my God. the work that went into it is
Yeah.
amazing. Yes, so
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I will link to everything in the episode's description so people can find it.
Great.
And that's great. And is there any last thing you want to share with my listeners before I let you go?
No, I thank you, and contrary to what I might have sounded like, I am optimistic about our future, but we'll see. It's up to us, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much. This was such a thrill.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Nerds, thank you so much for listening to this entire series. Holy crap, it was quite a thing to create. This was probably our biggest, maybe in line with Sparta, but man, the Bronze Age is wild because it's the Bronze Age, because it's so much older than all the other stuff that we work with, because it is so heavy in archaeological evidence and so lacking in text. It's just such a departure, but one that is utterly fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much. I hope you have too. These have been such joyful and fascinating conversations. I'm just so thrilled to have brought them all to you. You can find in the episode's description links to the books and things that were mentioned by Eric Cline, and I hope you check out more on the Bronze Age, or maybe just, the next time you hear a history bro trying to tell you about the Dark Ages and how everyone suddenly became incapable of intelligence until Homer sprung out. Now you'll know why that's all nonsense. I mean, it was pretty obviously nonsense, because that's just not how humanity works. But now you have the receipts. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer. And honestly, I mean, she's the person behind this Bronze Age series of episodes. It wouldn't possibly have existed without her. She might be existing in the background of this, but I want to make clear, it's a lot of Michaela's doing. And Laura Smith is the incredible audio engineer and production assistant who works on all of these conversation episodes, doing technological things that I never learned how to do. Thank you, Laura. Laura's also working to make my website helpful, so stay tuned for more on that. The podcast is part of the iHeartMedia network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, and help me continue bringing you all of this incredible mythological and historical stuff by becoming a patron, where you'll get access to loads of past bonus episodes. Patreon.com/mythsbaby, or the link is in the episode's description. Thank you all. Oh my god, I can't believe this series is over. It's been a wild ride. I just love the ancient world so much, and I really love that you do too. I am Liv, and I love this shit. I just said.